For 31 years, I worked as a family court mediator in Halifax. I sat across from people on the worst days of their lives. I learned to read a room the way some people read weather, the small signs, the things nobody says out loud, the silence that arrives right before something breaks. I retired at 63. I thought I was done with all of that. I was not. My daughter was 29 when she met him. She'd been living in Toronto for 4 years by then, working in urban planning, sharing a flat with 2 friends near Bloor West Village. She called me every Sunday without fail. We talked about everything: her work, my garden, the new Thai place that opened near my house in Dartmouth, whether I should finally get a second cat. She was happy. I knew what her happy sounded like. His name was Callum. He came into her life through a mutual friend at some kind of housewarming. She mentioned him once in passing. There was this guy, Mum, really well-read. He asked me what I thought about the Gardiner Expressway debate and actually listened to my answer, and I remember smiling because that was the thing my daughter valued most, being listened to. By February, she was calling him her boyfriend. By April, she was in love. By June, she was talking about the future in a way I had not heard her talk before, with that particular softness people have when they believe someone has chosen them. I flew to Toronto in July to meet him. He picked me up from Pearson himself. He had strong handshake, a good car, a rehearsed warmth that I noticed but decided not to trust yet. He asked about my work immediately. I told him I was retired. He said, "I've always respected people who spent their careers in service." And I said thank you and looked out the window. My daughter was radiant at dinner. She laughed at everything he said. Not nervously, genuinely. She leaned into him at the table and he touched the back of her hand and I thought, okay, maybe. His mother joined us the second evening. She came in wearing a silk blouse and carrying a bottle of wine she handed to Callum, not to my daughter. A small thing. I noted it the way I used to note small things in mediation sessions. Filed it away. Her name was Renata. Wait. No. Her name was Georgette. Georgette Ashworth. She sat across from me and smiled with everything but her eyes and said, "My son tells me you were in-law." I said, "Family mediation." She said, "Oh, so not quite law then," and laughed lightly, and my daughter laughed too, and Callum refilled the wine glasses. I drove back to my hotel that night and sat in the chair by the window for a long time. They got engaged in November. My daughter called me from the passenger seat of his car, and I could hear her smile through the phone, and I said all the right things because I loved her and the smile was real, and maybe I was wrong about the feeling I couldn't quite name. They moved in together that winter into a 2-bedroom condo in Leslieville. He had bought it 2 years earlier. It was his name on the deed. My daughter's lease ended conveniently at the same time, and she said, "It just makes sense financially, Mum. Rent in this city is impossible," which was true. It was true. The Sunday calls became Saturday calls. Then, every other week, she was busy, she said, settling in, learning his routines. He liked things a certain way. The kitchen organized by frequency of use, dinner before 7, quiet on the mornings he worked from home. I told myself she was adjusting. People adjust. Marriage is compromise. I came for Christmas. It was the first time I'd been to the condo. She had decorated it beautifully. A real tree, white lights, those little oranges with cloves she'd made every year since she was 12. But some of her things weren't there. The art prints she'd had in her old apartment, the ones from her trip through Quebec, the photo collage she'd made of her friends. I asked where they were, and she said, "Oh, Callum found them a bit busy for the space. We're going for a cleaner look." Going for, like it had been a decision made together. Georgette came on Christmas Day. She brought a full roasted ham even though my daughter had spent 2 days preparing dinner. She set it on the counter without asking and said, "I just thought there should be more protein," and my daughter thanked her. I watched my daughter move around her own kitchen that afternoon like someone who had learned to make herself smaller, not dramatically, not obviously, just efficiently, anticipating what was needed before it was asked for, keeping things smooth. I had seen that particular quality in women who came into my mediation sessions, women who had become experts at preventing, not at living, at preventing. Callum said very little to me directly that day. He spoke about me to my daughter while I was in the room. Your mother must find Halifax quiet after her career. Your mother seems like she has a lot of opinions. Not unkindly, casually. The way you speak about someone who is not quite present. I flew home on the 27th and cried in the airport in a way I had not cried since my own husband passed 11 years ago. Spring came. The calls came less. When we did speak, my daughter sounded careful. She chose her words the way people choose steps on ice. She used to talk fast, interrupt herself, circle back, go on tangents. She was a person who thought out loud. Now she finished sentences completely and said little beyond them. I asked her once directly, "Are you happy?" She said, "Of course. Why would you ask that?" The question itself was the answer. In 31 years of mediation, I had learned that the people least able to say no are always the first to say, "Of course." I started calling her on weekday mornings. Early, when I knew Callum would be in the office, she answered twice. The third time she texted, "Can't talk right now, everything's fine." The exclamation mark was not something my daughter used. She considered them imprecise. In April, her best friend from university, a woman she'd known for 12 years, called me. She had never called me before. She said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I just don't know who else to talk to." She said my daughter had canceled plans 4 times. She said when they did see each other, Callum came along. She said the last time she'd managed to get my daughter alone for coffee, my daughter had seemed fine until her phone lit up with his name. And then she'd ended the coffee early and left cash on the table without waiting for her change. I thanked her friend. I hung up and I sat at my kitchen table for 1 hour. Then I called my daughter and said I was coming to visit. She said, "Oh, it's really not a great time, Mum." I said, "I bought the ticket already." There was a pause. Then she said, "Okay." I arrived on a Tuesday. Callum was home, which I had not expected. He greeted me at the door in the way he always greeted me, warm. Correct, slightly performative. He had taken the afternoon off, he said, to welcome me properly. I noticed my daughter's face when he said that. A very small adjustment, the kind you only catch if you know what you're looking for. That evening we had dinner at their table. The 3 of us. My daughter had made a white bean soup, the kind her grandmother taught her, with crusty bread and a good aged cheddar. It was beautiful. It smelled like every good thing I associated with her. Callum took 1 spoonful and put his spoon down. He said, "Did you add cream to this?" My daughter said no. He said, "It's too thin. You know I like it thicker." My daughter said, "I can add some cream now if..." He said, "It's fine," in a way that meant it was not fine, and picked up his spoon again, and my daughter ate the rest of her meal watching the surface of her bowl. I said, "I think it's wonderful. Your grandmother would have said the same." He looked at me. I looked back. After dinner, my daughter did the dishes. I offered to help, and she said no, it's fine. She had a system. Callum sat in the living room and turned on the television. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched my daughter wash a pot, and I said quietly, "You don't have to make yourself small for anyone." She didn't turn around. She said, "Mum, please don't." That night, I lay in the guest room, which was also his home office, I noticed, not really a guest room at all, and I made a decision. The next morning, he went to work. My daughter made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, and for a while, neither of us spoke. Then she started to cry. Not loudly, the quiet kind, the kind that has been waiting a long time for a door to open. She told me about the first year, which had been good. genuinely good, and how she hadn't noticed when things shifted because they shifted so slowly. She told me about the comments that had started small, "That blouse doesn't work on you," and grown until she stopped buying clothes without checking with him first. She told me about the evening she'd made plans with her friend without mentioning it to him first and how he hadn't yelled, just gone quiet and cold for 3 days until she canceled. She told me about money, how he managed their shared account and how she'd stopped knowing what was in it, how she'd started feeling like she needed to justify her purchases, her $8 oat latte, her $40 birthday gift for her colleague, small things, ordinary things. She said, "I know how this sounds." I said, "It sounds like you've been carrying something very heavy alone for a long time." She said, "I love him." I said, "I know." I did not say everything I was thinking. I was not there to tell her what to feel. I was there to make sure she knew she was not invisible. I said, "Does he ever?" And I stopped and started again. "Has he ever hurt you physically?" She shook her head quickly, then slower. Then she said, "Once." He grabbed my arm. He said he was just trying to get my attention. I believed him. I put both my hands around my coffee cup and breathed. There is something people who have never worked in family law don't understand about this moment. The moment when someone tells you the first physical thing. It is never the beginning. It is always the middle of something that has been building for a very long time, and the person telling you almost always frames it as the other person's defense, not as what it was. He grabbed my arm. He said he was just trying to get my attention. I believed him. That sentence is not about a grabbed arm. That sentence is about a person who has been taught to interpret her own pain as misunderstanding. I had filed this pattern 100 times in 31 years. I had never filed it for my own daughter. I asked her if she would be willing to speak with someone. A counselor? Not to make any decisions, just to speak. She said, "Maybe." I said that was enough for now. That afternoon, Callum came home, and the version of my daughter I'd had that morning, the one sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her tears and her truth, disappeared. Not dramatically. She simply recalibrated. She smiled. She asked how his day was. She moved through the kitchen the way she always moved through that kitchen, efficiently, preventively. He looked at me over her shoulder and said, "You two have a good day?" I said, "We did." He said, "Good," and opened the refrigerator. The visit ended. I flew home. For 3 weeks, I worked quietly. I had kept contacts from my mediation years. A woman in social services in Toronto I'd met at a conference in 2009, a former colleague who now consulted with legal aid clinics, a woman who ran a support organization for financial abuse specifically. I did not call them on my daughter's behalf. She had not asked me to. But I refreshed those contacts. I made sure my files were current. I prepared, because in 31 years the thing I had learned above everything else is this: you cannot force the door, but when it opens, you have to be ready to walk through it quickly. The call came on a Thursday evening in October. She was crying before she said a single word. I knew from the quality of the silence before the crying what kind of call it was. I had known that silence in other people's lives for 3 decades. He had come home from a dinner with a client, not quite sober, not quite himself. She had asked a simple question about their finances, about why a transfer she'd been waiting for hadn't come through. He told her to stop monitoring things she didn't understand. She said she had a right to know. He stood up from the table. He slapped her across the face. She said it so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "He hit me, Mom." And then, after a pause, "And this is the part I will carry for the rest of my life." She said, "And then he sat back down and finished his dinner." I said, "Where is he now?" She said, "He went to bed." He said, "I provoked him." I said, "Are you safe right now?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I need you to do one thing. Go to the bathroom, lock the door, and don't hang up." She did. I used my other phone. I had a second line, an old habit from mediation days when I sometimes needed to stay on a call while making another, and I called the woman I knew in Toronto, social services. It was 10:40 at night. She answered. I told her what I needed. She made 2 calls and called me back within 12 minutes. By 11:15, a service had been arranged, a safe arrangement for my daughter, coordinated through a women's support organization in her district. A worker would be reachable by text within the hour. I got back on the main line. I told my daughter what was available. I told her she did not have to make any decisions tonight. I told her I was on the 7 a.m. flight from Halifax. She said, "You don't have to." I said, "I'm already looking at the ticket." She left on a Friday morning while he was in the shower. She took her important documents. She knew where they were because I had asked her in one of our calls, casually, where she kept her passport, her SIN card, her health card. She took one bag. She took her laptop. She left her key on the kitchen counter. She texted me from the street. I landed at 11:47. She was staying with a colleague, a woman who asked no questions and made up the sofa bed without being asked. In the weeks that followed, we worked through things step by step. She applied for her own bank account at a branch she'd never used with him. She called a family lawyer, through legal aid at first, then through a referral my former colleague arranged. Because of the financial entanglement, she had contributed to shared household expenses for nearly 2 years without her name on anything. The legal picture was complicated but not hopeless. In Ontario, there are provisions. There is recourse. It takes time and documentation, but it exists. She filed a police report. She almost didn't. She went back and forth for 2 weeks. I did not push her. I sat next to her in the waiting room of the police station on a rainy November Tuesday, and I held her hand, and I let her decide. She decided. He was charged. I will not go into the details of what followed legally because that is not my story to tell. What I will say is that the system was slow and imperfect, and sometimes deeply frustrating, and she had support through all of it, and she did not go through any of it alone. Georgette called me once, about 6 weeks after everything. She said she wanted me to understand that Callum was going through a very difficult time and that my daughter was not entirely without fault in the dynamic they had created. I said, "I appreciate that you called." I said nothing else. I had learned long ago that some conversations cannot be argued into sense. Some people have built their whole identity around the story they have chosen to tell. You cannot take that story from them in one phone call, and you do not have to try. I hung up and made myself a cup of tea. It's been 14 months now. My daughter is back in Toronto in her own apartment, a 1-bedroom near Roncesvalles that she found herself, signed herself, furnished slowly and deliberately with things that are only hers. She went back to therapy after the first month. She runs on the Humber River Trail on weekend mornings. She called me last Sunday at 11, her usual voice, going on a tangent about a new exhibition at the AGO and whether she wanted to take a pottery class. And I sat in my kitchen and listened to her think out loud. And I thought, there she is. There she is. I have been asked since, by people who know pieces of this story, whether I blame myself for not seeing it sooner. Whether I think I should have pushed harder earlier, whether there was a moment I missed that I should not have. I think about that question carefully every time it comes up. Because the honest answer is, I saw things. I saw the missing art prints. I saw Georgette's wine handed to her son and not to my daughter. I saw the soup comment at that dinner table. I saw all of it, but seeing is not the same as being able to act. My daughter was not ready. And no amount of maternal urgency can move the moment before the person at the center of it is ready to move. That is the hardest thing. It was the hardest thing in 31 years of sitting across from families in the worst chapters of their lives, and it does not get easier when the person sitting across from you is your own child. What I could do, what I did do, was stay ready, keep my contacts current, know the numbers, Know the process. Know that when the door finally opened, I would be standing on the other side of it with everything she needed. If your daughter has stopped talking the way she used to talk, if her sentences have become careful and short and finished, if her laugh comes a half second late, if she says, "Of course," when you ask if she's happy, please stay ready. Keep your phone charged. Know the numbers. In Canada, you can reach the Assaulted Women's Helpline at any hour, 1-866-863-0511. It is available in over 200 languages. No one has to give their name. And if you are watching this and you are the daughter in this story, not the mother, you are not too far in. It is not too complicated. It is not your fault for not seeing it sooner. The door exists. Someone is on the other side of it, ready. What city are you watching from today? And if this story stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need it. It might be the most important thing you share this year. I have thought about cause and effect a great deal over the course of my life, not in any abstract philosophical way, more in the practical, unglamorous way that comes from sitting across a table from people whose lives have come undone and trying to understand how they arrived at that particular chair on that particular afternoon. What I have come to understand is this: things rarely happen all at once. They accumulate. The way a wall doesn't fall from one crack but from 100 small ones, each one ignored because it seemed too minor to address. Callum didn't become who he showed himself to be at that dinner table in one evening. He became that person through years of small permissions. Things that were allowed, then overlooked, then normalized, until the man who sat back down and finished his meal after striking his wife believed, on some level, that he had done nothing requiring explanation. And my daughter didn't find herself in that kitchen, watching the surface of her soup bowl overnight either. She arrived there the same way. Gradually, through a series of small adjustments that each seemed in isolation like reasonable compromise. That is the particular cruelty of this kind of relationship. It doesn't announce itself. It wears the clothes of love while it works. I think about the intelligence it takes to survive something like that. Not the intelligence of exams or credentials. The other kind. The kind that keeps you reading a room, keeps you one step ahead of someone else's mood, keeps you functioning under conditions that would break someone who hadn't learned to be so quietly resilient. My daughter applied an extraordinary amount of intelligence to the project of keeping her life manageable under Callum's roof. She just applied it in the wrong direction, through no fault of her own. That intelligence didn't disappear when she left. She took it with her. She is using it now, in her own apartment near Roncesvalles, in her own life, on her own terms. That is the thing about resilience that I don't think gets said clearly enough. It doesn't grow from easy circumstances. It grows from the ones that required everything you had. My daughter is not resilient despite what she went through. She is the person she is now, in part, because of what she survived and chose to walk away from. The walking away was not weakness. It was the most precise, most courageous act of intelligence she has ever performed. As for Callum, I don't spend much time thinking about what becomes of him. That is not coldness, it is clarity. What a person does with the consequences of their own choices is their work, not mine. He built something that collapsed under its own weight. That is not a punishment I arranged. That is simply how weight works. What I do think about is the women still sitting in rooms like the one my daughter sat in, still watching their soup bowls, still saying, of course, when someone asks if they are happy, still believing the grabbed arm was about attention, not control. I think about them because I was in this work long enough to know that every one of them has someone in their life who has noticed something. A missing painting on the wall, a laugh that arrives a half second late, a phone call that ends too quickly. If you are that someone, stay ready. Sharpen what you know. Keep your contacts current. And if you are the woman in the room, I want you to know that the part of you that remembers who you were before is not gone. It has simply been waiting with remarkable patience for the door to open. You are allowed to open it.